This here is the all-new Peugeot 408 and it is spearheading Peugeot's revival in Malaysia, especially with parent company Stellantis now officially in the country. With its stunning looks, it's creating a massive buzz on social media as well. So in this review, we're gonna find out if there's any substance behind that style, if it favors comfort or handling, and if you're already sold after all that, which of the three variants should you buy? All that and more coming right up. Let's go. So Peugeot, or Peugeot as it's called back home, has had massive ups and downs here in Malaysia. It had a huge success under NASA about 15 years ago, but through the years it all came crashing down. Between them not being able to handle the sheer volume and of course all the niggling issues that came along with it, Peugeot became a brand that nobody would touch with a 10-foot pole for quite a bit. After that, it was taken over by Burmas, but it just stayed quiet for a few years. Now, finally, its parent group, Stellantis, is taking over the Peugeot brand, and it has massive plans for Malaysia, and according to them, they are here to stay. They've completely bought over the old NASA plant in Gurun, and these latest cars are already assembled over there. Beyond Peugeot, they've also got plans for other brands under the group. This includes Leapmotor and Citroën in the near term, and maybe at some point Jeep and Alfa Romeo as well. It's all quite exciting right now. But before all those future plans can come to fruition, in the here and now, the Peugeot 408 that we have here needs to be a success. Now, the 408 name is quite familiar for Malaysia. We've had two different generations of the old sedan, but as you can clearly tell from the looks of it, it's a sedan no more. In fact, it's actually hard to classify what this car actually is. It may have a tailgate at the back, but it's just too tall to be a hatchback, but not quite tall enough to be a traditional SUV. As it is somewhat of a combination of everything, and in terms of form factor, I think it works really well. The shape, the styling, it's also unique, so sporty, sexy even. It even works on a practical level as well. The ride height is tall enough for you to not have to worry about going through speed bumps or shallow floods. The driving position is high enough for you to have a commanding view out almost like an SUV, and even getting in and out of it is much easier than a low-slung sedan. And the best part is it does all that without looking like a frumpy old-school SUV. With a lot of Malaysian car buyers, or rather pretty much everyone around the world, moving from sedans into SUVs, this to me looks like the perfect middle point. Let's say I'm a Honda Accord owner right now. Instead of going straight into the CR-V, this looks far more interesting. And that neatly leads us to pricing, because that's exactly where the Peugeot 408 is priced at here in Malaysia. There are three variants to choose from, starting with the base Allure for 146,000 ringgit, the mid-range Premium for 166,000, and of course the flagship GT for 196,000 ringgit. But don't for a second be fooled by the relatively low starting price, because this is as close as we can get to a car version of a supermarket loss leader. You know, when they advertise something for really cheap, like a pack of carrots or a carton of milk, just to get you there, and then you'll end up spending well over 200 to 300 ringgit on a full trolley. Is the exact same story here. The base price is purely there to catch your attention to begin with, but once you get to the showroom, you will be naturally pushed towards the far more expensive GT. The grey car here is not even the base model. This is the mid-range Premium, but it looks terrible next to the top spec blue GT. The reflector headlights look cheap compared to the full projectors on the more expensive model, and the full chrome grille just looks a bit tacky, a bit garish next to the body colored item on the GT. And then you've got the wheels. The bottom two variants use 18-inch alloys, which look far too small for the body, especially next to the monstrous 20s on the top spec GT. On looks alone, you really have to go for the most expensive model to get the full 408 experience to make it look like the way it should. But if you can stretch the range stopper, man, what a fantastic looking car this is. I was driving this car for about a week and I turned more head in this car. I got more looks than when I was driving a proper sports car. It is that eye-catching. Peugeot styling has come a long way from 10-15 years ago, and I especially like the model badging above the front grille over here. It's a bit of an old school throwback, but it fits really well, and even the fang-like LED DRLs stretching down from the headlights look super distinctive. Speaking of styling, even more unique are the wheels over here. These look like they're taken straight off a concept car. This uses a crisscross design instead of the usual spokes leading towards the center that I'm amazed they even got it balanced to begin with. But exactly like how women would go through a lot of pain to wear high heels all day long, there's a big price to pay for all this style. With these 20-inch wheels, the tires are just such low profile, there's hardly any rubber left to absorb any bumps on the road. If you compare the tire profile of the regular car next to this, the difference is just staggering. And of course, it's going to cost you quite literally later on as well, because these tires are not going to be cheap. This Goodyear Eagle F1A5 is priced at about 1,500 ringgit each. That's per corner. That's about the same price as most people would pay for an entire set of tires. I fully expect 3 to 5 years down the road, we'll start seeing these cars running on, really cheap budget China tires. They shouldn't, but we know for a fact they will anyway. Also exclusive to the top spec GT model are the side emblems on the front doors. Just like how you have to pay extra for it on a Ferrari, this only comes on the most expensive model of the Peugeot 408. There are more differences back here as well. The top spec GT gets this beautiful 3D claw effect taillights, while the regular versions get very generic LEDs instead. But overall, I gotta say it again, this is such a good looking car. It gives off a bit of a Lamborghini Urus vibe, especially with the sharp bootlit spoiler and the so-called cat's ears top spoiler. These, by the way, actually serve a dual purpose. Beyond just making the car look better, the bulges actually hide the hinges for the tailgate. That is clever design. The one thing it's missing, however, are visible exhaust tips, even on the top spec GT. That's a bit disappointing. Before we head inside, I do have to mention one thing. The exterior fit and finish of these two cars is actually quite bad. There are visible inconsistency at different places between these two cars, which is quite worrying. The tailgate of the grey car isn't quite aligned, while there's too big of a gap between the bonnet and the front bumper of this blue car. I gave the Tesla quite a bit of flack for similar issues, so it's only fair that I bring it up on these cars as well. Inside, it continues on the exterior's modern and stylo look, which is such a big breath of fresh air. More recently, we've been rather jaded with a sea of boring and generic interior designs from a lot of Chinese car makers, that this looks different, quirky, and far more special in comparison. There's a lot of unique things in here. It doesn't just wow you with one massive screen in the middle. There's a lot of smaller, original takes on regular items. Take the instrument cluster for instance. Now, everybody has gone digital lately, so here comes Peugeot with a 3D meter cluster. Well, to call it 3D is a bit of a misnomer because it's more like two different planes of displays. You've got your regular screen in the back, but with a panel right ahead of it where displays sort of float in front of it. It's really, really unique. However, this works by having a projector right on top of the binnacle over here, and when you drive around, it gets really warm, so I question how long this will actually last in Malaysian weather. Beyond that, you've got your usual Peugeot iCockpit design. By that, I mean an instrument cluster placed at the top of the dashboard, and a very small steering wheel placed below the meters. Now I have to say I did have a Peugeot 208 GTI as a personal car about 10 years ago, and I did get used to the high meters and small steering wheel in about a week or two. However, I do recommend that you come to the showroom and give it a test drive to see whether your own driving position can fit this unique layout. For me, it all fits rather nicely. I can see the entire meter, but most of you who drive like that, fully reclined, you will probably see half the meters completely blocked by your steering wheel, or have to drive with a wheel much lower than what you're used to. Moving on, the center screen, or rather screens on this top spec GT is also rather special. You've got a usual widescreen display at the top, which looks really good with a nice contrast, but at the bottom, this is what Peugeot calls the eye toggles. This is a series of shortcuts that you can fully customize, and it's all nicely placed in a large tile section that is easy to recognize and reach. But as usual, it's not without its issues, because say you want to change the aircon settings, you can just press the climate button over here. There is this really fancy animation that takes over the screen for about a second or two before you can then adjust the fan. That takes way too long. The worst part is there is actually a hard button down here that does the exact same thing without the delay in animation. I just don't get why there is a difference. But having said that, you can actually set shortcuts for your favorite climate control settings. Let's say the driver's side always prefers 18 degrees while the passenger side prefers 20. You can set shortcuts like so. That's pretty clever. Beyond that, you've got wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which works really well, and audio comes out of a 10-speaker 4-cal sound system. This sounds actually quite good, far better than the standard systems on lower base models. Going back to the instrument cluster, this is customizable as well, and you can even change the colors according to your mood. That's very nice to have. Down here though, it's not quite the best. You select gears by moving this toggle up and down, but the park button is really small up there. And then you've also got a drive mode rocker switch down here, but the action of pressing up and down feels so different. It's just so inconsistent. I think the build quality in this car needs a bit of work. While overall it does feel high quality, everything fits well, even the plastic quality feels rather decent with most of the touch points covered in leather. There are a few sticking points here and there. For instance, this blue GT has a rather iffy glove box. It doesn't quite close up nicely. You really have to slam it in before it shuts, while the grey car has a much nicer closing action. But you know what, at the very least, they've finally fixed the small glove box issue of most right-hand drive Peugeots. Here you've got a pretty large space in there. Next, the seats, which are actually very comfortable, at least on the top spec GT. These are NEPA leather-lined AGR approved seats with massage function. AGR is a German group focusing on back support, and on this car it's really nice and supportive. On the base non-GT though, yeah, not quite as good. As for other quirks, you actually have mini games built into the screen, including tic-tac-toe and hangman. I think this would fit an EV far better, where you're sitting in the car while it charges. Here, I don't think there's a point to it, especially because it doesn't work when the car is moving though. On the GT, you also get a sunroof up top, although the sunshade is actually manual, which is a bit disappointing for a car at this price. Another thing that I absolutely hate are these Maggie Me coil mats that come with the car. This just makes the whole vehicle feel far cheaper than it actually is. That's got to go. Give me proper original carpets, please. As you move away from the top spec GT, you do lose out on a lot of toys. The 3D instrument cluster is gone, and so are the 4-cal sound system. Even the clever eye toggle screen is replaced by a set of physical controls for the aircon, which actually looks ugly and rather out of place. Beyond that, the Alcantara inserts are replaced with rough fabric. The lime green contrast stitching is gone, and the entire headliner is changed from black to boring grey instead. And like I said, the seats are flatter and less supportive, and if you go for the base model, you even get fabric upholstery and manual adjustment on the front left seat. Worst of all, the 360-degree camera, which to me is now a necessity rather than a luxury, is only fitted on the GT. Moving on to the rear seats, it's a bit of a mixed bag back here. Legroom is actually very good, and there's plenty of toe room to move your feet around as well. But headroom, as you can see, is very limited. I am only 167 centimeters tall, and even I'm struggling back here. That's not very good. But at the same time, the seats at least are comfortable, and this is one of the few cars where the rear headrests are actually usable. Other than that, there is also a marked difference in terms of material quality back here. The door cards are now hard instead of soft touch at the front, and even the plastic trim around the window controls back here look really cheap. Thankfully, the boot of this car is actually very good. You get nearly 550 liters of space, and it's also very wide and long as well. Despite this car's looks, it's very nearly as practical as large SUVs. One thing to note though is that while lower variants get a space-saver spare tyre, the top spec GT only gets a tyre repair kit. So driving the 408 is quite a highlight. Usually when you get a car that looks this good, driving it becomes a little bit disappointing because it's very hard to live up to the style. But this one, it just about manages to drive as well as it looks. Let's talk about all the numbers. First, up front is a 1.6 litre 4-cylinder turbocharged engine. Now Peugeot calls it a PureTech engine now, but we all know it's the same old Prince or PSA engines that we've seen for about 15 years now. I mean, I'm sure they've made changes here and there, but by and large it is the same engine that we all know and love. Here it has been uprated further higher than we've seen before, except for the highest end 308 GTI. Here it makes 218 PS and 300 Newton meters of torque. Those are really high numbers for a 1.6 turbo. It's also paired to a new transmission, an 8-speed EAT. This is a traditional torque converter, not a CVT, not a dual clutch gearbox, and it's all the better for it. I think lately more and more car makers are going back towards conventional torque converters, and I think it's a very good move. Overall, this drivetrain combo is very good. It's nice to drive, it sounds decent, and the power is very good as well. 0 to 100 is done in about 9 seconds or so. That's not particularly fast, but more than fast enough for regular Malaysian roads. Even if you're a bit of a keen driver, want to attack the mountains every now and then, this is a very good car to do it in. There's more than enough power to have quite a lot of fun behind the wheel. As usual for this PSA engine, you get a big massive push of torque even from low down the rev range, and then once you've got it, you just ride this high flat torque curve all the way towards the top of the rev range. It is quite something. I love this engine. New for the 408 though is active sound control. So put it in sport mode, plant your foot down, and you get a bit of a deeper engine note. Now most of this comes from the speakers, of course, not the actual engine itself, but yeah, it's quite exciting. It sounds pretty decent, I'd say. One thing that's clear though, while this car looks completely all new both on the outside and on the inside over here, it still has that very familiar Peugeot driving experience. If you've driven a relatively modern Peugeot over the past 10 years, this will feel similar to your last experience. Especially that rather rubber bandy effect of the transmission. Even though this is an all-new gearbox now from 6 to 8 speed, it still feels rather similar to the old 308, the 408, and so on. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I guess if you're moving from an old car into the new one, that little bit of familiarity can be a good thing. But if you're moving in from a whole different car, it does feel a touch old school, not quite all new. One thing I don't really like though is the initial throttle response of this car, especially coming off from a stop. As soon as you just about touch the throttle, the car jumps forward in a very abrupt, uncomfortable, jerky manner. Between these two cars, the GT and the Premium both have similar traits, although somehow it's worse on the GT rather than in the Premium. Now, I hope this is something to do with the gearbox learning how you drive, so over time it gets better and better, but it hasn't really changed within the week that I've been driving these cars. Hopefully, it can get better as you drive it. On to fuel consumption, is actually just about okay. Between these two cars, I've averaged about the same actually, between 8.5 to 9 liters per 100 kilometers. That's not too bad considering this car's size and performance, but if you're looking at fuel consumption alone, you gotta remember Hondas of this size with the same level of performance as well are far more efficient. The CVTs, hate them all you want, they are still better in terms of efficiency. Next, let's move on to ride and handling. First things first though, we gotta talk about the iCockpit dashboard layout. Me personally, I really like this small steering wheel. It makes me feel like I'm driving a PlayStation rig or something. It adds on a little bit of that joy, a little bit of that fun factor behind the wheel. Now, taking corners with this steering wheel is just so easy. It takes far less effort. It makes the car feel a bit more nimble, a bit more agile than it actually is probably. And speaking of that, this car is probably far more athletic than most of its competitors. Which competitors exactly is a bit hard to pick because, as you know, we have less and less sedans in the market right now. The Volkswagen Passat and the Honda Accord, they are both gone now. Pretty much the only D-segment sedan that we have in Malaysia left is the Toyota Camry, and I doubt anyone will be cross-shopping between a Camry and this car right here. For its proper true competitors, I guess you're going to look at the SUVs, the Mazda CX-5s and the Honda CR-Vs, and I would say this is far more dynamic than any of those tall, heavy SUVs. Unfortunately though, as fun as this car is to drive, the ride comfort suffers a little bit. Now, especially on this GT with the big 20-inch wheels and rubber band profile tires, you do feel quite a lot of the road surface as you drive. Here we are on particularly coarse Putrajaya roads, you can hear it as well. These are UHP tires of course, so they are not so much focused on comfort, more on performance, so it is acceptably so. Move on to the Premium however, with the far thicker SUV spec tires, and that car is far more comfortable than this one, especially when it comes to really sharp jolts, small bumps, rough roads. The smaller wheels definitely help to smooth out the bumps. But that's not to say that the GT is strictly uncomfortable. That would be too harsh. I think if you're moving from a Japanese sedan or an SUV, this will feel fairly decent. If anything, despite the huge wheels, it still manages to handle bigger bumps and road undulations fairly well. This is a very classy, very sophisticated ride and handling package. If it's me, I would prefer the car to be a touch more comfortable still, but most people will find this to be just about perfect, I'd say. Speaking of softer suspension, this car actually does have a twin, the Citroen C5X, which is a bit more comfort oriented. But here in Malaysia, Stellantis is going to position the Citroen brand as a bit more of an affordable mainstream car, so likely we are not getting the C5X over here. That's a bit of a shame because I would love to have a car similar to this, which is more comfortable, perhaps less exciting to drive and to look at as well, but I sure will appreciate its better ride quality. On to Refinement, it's the exact same story as the ride. The GT is again far worse because of the wheel and tire combo. There's so much extra noise coming into the cabin, while the Premium is far quieter. That is just the much more comfortable package, whereas the GT, I mean, as always, to be properly stylish, there's always a price to pay. But thankfully, in terms of wind noise, it's actually very good. Even up to 130, 140, it still feels quieter than a comparable Japanese car. So in terms of refinement, it is very good, but within the confines of 20-inch tires. You still have to remember that part. Now, lastly, in terms of active safety or ADAS semi-autonomous driving systems, this car does have AEB or autonomous emergency braking through the entire range, even the basic one, which is all good. But the base version does not get adaptive cruise control and active lane keep assist for a level 2 semi-autonomous driving, which for a car that is priced at 146,000 ringgit is a bit hard to accept. These are features that Malaysians have come to expect to be standard fit even for cars under 100,000 ringgit. So for it to be exclusive on the higher, more expensive models is a bit of a shame. Especially so because the system is actually very, very good. You set the adaptive cruise control level 2 semi-autonomous driving on the highways and it drives very smoothly. The steering input is very nice and clean. Even the throttle and brake inputs, super smooth, not as abrupt as most other cars out there. This is one of the better systems in the market, that is for sure. So that's my full review of the all-new Peugeot 408 here in Malaysia. All in all, I think it's a great package combining fantastic looks on the outside and the inside with above-average performance as well. It's also far more dynamic than SUVs of the same price range. But of course, it's also less comfortable than other alternatives, especially the GT with the humongous wheels. And as we've seen with these two cars, there are a few build quality issues here and there. Having said all that though, most people will be sold purely on looks alone, which I totally get, and they will be happy to know there's plenty of substance behind all this style. Just remember though, if you're looking at the 408, only go for the GT. Do you agree or disagree with me on this? Do let me know in the comment section below. Thank you for watching everyone, and stay safe.